Hi everyone, Kevin C. here from Santa Rosa Junior College with Winemaking Basics Part 2. Let's talk about crush, press, and ferment. So back to Part 1, we talked about the basic winemaking process, and we talked about harvest decisions last time and how to pick grapes that are ideally ripe for making wine. Once we get those in the vineyard, into the winery, we crush, press, and ferment. With white wines, we crush first, we press second, we ferment third. With red wines, we crush first, we ferment second, because we keep the juice in contact with the skins, and we press the finished wine off the skins in step 3. So for white wines, we crush the berries, we press the juice away from the skins, and then we ferment. Let's look at that process. So you've probably seen scenes like this out in the vineyard with grapes being picked. Here, red wines being picked into half-ton picking bins. If you'd like to see a nice romantic look at picking, check out that YouTube link at the bottom. When the grapes come to the winery, they're dumped into a receiving hopper. This is at Franciscan Winery in Napa Valley. So this would be a receiving hopper. See this big auger down here? That spins, that turns around. It's a big screw that pushes the grapes to this end of the receiving hopper. And then, of course, during harvest, this will be uncovered. This is a conveyor belt that will take the grapes up and dump them into a crusher destemmer. Here's a close-up of that auger and the receiving hopper. Crusher destemmer looks like this, and so grapes will come up that conveyor belt and be dumped into this part of the crusher destemmer. The full clusters will come through this cylinder, and there are paddles. You can see one here at the end. The paddles will turn in the opposite direction of the cylinder, push the grape clusters against the inside of the cylinder, and berries, the grapes, will pop through each one of these holes in the cylinders. The stems then, without the berries, will continue down and fall out the end of the crusher destemmer, be collected in some kind of a bin and taken off and composted out in your compost pile or your vineyard. The grapes then that fall down into the middle of the crusher destemmer will go through, oftentimes, some rollers down here. And those rollers will actually be what crushes the grapes themselves. So up here at the top is really the destemming process. And down here, if the winemaker chooses to use the rollers, that's the crushing process. And the rollers, if you looked at an end view, are just two hard rubber rollers, and they turn in opposite directions. And when they do, and the berries, the little grape here, falls down in the middle of those rollers, the grape gets crushed. And the winemaker can adjust how far apart or close together these rollers are depending on how vigorously they'd like to crush the grapes. That's one of the key winemaker decisions. Now, we were at Kendrick Vineyards, and I'm referring to the Wine 111 field trip. We talked about the fact that the Kendrick winemaker, Stuart Johnson, when he's making Pinot Noir, will often add whole clusters to the fermenting bin. So what that means is you don't destem the clusters, you leave the stems in. And one of the keys at the stem is that the stems have turned brown or lignified. So look at this nice brown stem here versus the very green stem over here. So if you're going to put whole clusters in your fermenter, you want the stems to be well lignified, hardened off, turned brown. The green stems over on the left here, if those are in your fermenter, you will often extract some green flavors that you probably don't want in your wine. So winemakers will sometimes do a percentage of whole clusters, but they want typically the whole clusters to be nicely lignified before they're put in the fermenter. Once in the case of white grapes, and whole clusters I was talking about there actually refers to red grapes. With white grapes, again, we said we would press the juice away from the skins. And here's a wine press, again at Franciscan in Napa Valley. So this big cylinder here is where the skins and the juice are separated when the juice is pressed away from the skins. Here's a look at the inside of one of those cylinders. And what you can't see, or you can just see the edge of, is a bag down here. And that bag will inflate inside the cylinder, pushing the grapes and the juice against the opposite side of the cylinder. And the juice will actually flow through the perforations in the cylinder and be collected down at the bottom. The skins will remain inside the press. And so here's what that press looks like. This shows red grapes being loaded into the press, but it's the same with the white grapes. The door is opened and the grapes and the juice, in the case of whites, is poured into the press. Then the door is closed and that bag I mentioned inside is inflated. That pushes the juice through those perforated channels on the opposite side of the cylinder. Then you deflate the bag, you'd rotate the press around, you'd do this a few times, you'd rotate the press to break up all the skins, you'd press a little bit harder next time, a little bit harder next time, until you're done. And then the door can be opened, the press can be rotated to get rid of the skins. You've collected your juice or wine in the case of red wines, juice in the case of whites, and pump that off to a separate tank. After you get the white juice in a tank, you'll do the fermentation. You'll pump the juice to a tank or a barrel if you're going to do barrel fermentation, and you will add yeast. And yeast do the alcoholic fermentation. Usually, I should say, you'll add yeast. The alcoholic fermentation takes sugar in the grape juice and converts it to carbon dioxide plus alcohol, and ethanol is the main alcohol in wine. So this process is when the wine is actually made. Juice is turned into wine by yeast. Yeast also produce flavors during this process, and many of those are important to the wine. Different yeast strains produce different flavors. Here's one particular yeast strain that's popular for Sauvignon Blanc. And the reason it's popular is this particular strain, as it notes in this first bullet point, has high ability to develop the aroma in Sauvignon Blanc wine. So there are many different strains of Saccharomyces, which is one of the primary yeasts we use for fermentation. Different strains produce different flavors. It's the same species, just like humans have different characteristics, so do yeast. This one is great for Sauvignon Blanc. Now the other thing a winemaker can do is they can do native fermentations, also called indigenous fermentations. This choice, what it does is it uses the yeast that are stuck to the grapes when they come in from the vineyard to do the fermentation. Because there are many different strains or even species of yeast stuck to the grapes in the vineyard, you can get some complexity by allowing native yeast to do the fermentation, because each of those different strains or species will produce different flavors. The risk is you can have a species or strain that'll produce bad flavors. So winemakers have a choice. Do you add yeast, which is very predictable, like this one you can buy from Scott Labs, shown up here at the top? Or do you take a little bit of risk and hope for more complexity by doing a native yeast fermentation, using the yeast that come in from the vineyard that are stuck to the grapes? You can, and also when you do a native yeast, you will be using yeast that are already in your winery, in the air, on the equipment, etc. Following yeast fermentation, you will often do malolactic fermentation. This is a separate process that's done for flavor, to soften the acid oftentimes, and to make the wines more stable in the bottle. Chardonnays will often get malolactic fermentation. The winemaker can stop it if they don't want it, but Chardonnays usually get it, as do most red wines. Malolactic fermentation produces lactic acid and, notably, a flavor compound called diacetyl, which gives Chardonnays their butter aroma. So there's the malolactic fermentation process. Malic acid is converted by bacteria. So remember, our alcoholic fermentation to make the wine was done by yeast. This one is a bacterial fermentation. Yeast and bacteria are both single-cell organisms, but they're quite different. In this case, malic acid makes carbon dioxide plus lactic acid plus some flavors like that butter flavor. And different strains of malolactic bacteria have different characteristics, just like different strains of yeast have different characteristics. Some strains of malolactic produce more butter flavor than others. Okay, so we're done with the white wine process, and now we already talked a little bit about the red process, but again I mentioned that the last two steps, fermenting and pressing, are opposite for red wines because we ferment in contact with the skins. We'll talk more about skin contact in part 3 of winemaking basics, but let me tell you about one key part of the process right now, about one key part of the process, and that is punch down or pump over of the cap. The cap is the layer of grape skins that forms on top of a fermentation, and you can see that cap here. This is a nice picture of a home winemaker fermenting in a food grade garbage can, and all the CO2 has pushed up, the CO2 produced by yeast during fermentation has pushed up the grape skins to the top. Yeast is CO2 is a gas. It's going to rise, it's going to push the skins to the top of the fermenter, and you get this cap of skins on the top. Now in the middle here, the winemaker has used a plunger here with this white handle to push the cap down into the fermentation, and that's why you see the CO2 bubbles here, because they push the cap down into the fermentation. That's key because you can have problems with a cap. You can have bad bugs growing on the cap, and you also have separation of skins from the juice or the wine, because the cap is at the top, the juice or the wine is at the bottom. So you don't want bad bugs, you don't want separation of juice and skins. So you can punch the cap down into the fermenter, or you can pump the juice or the wine over the top of the cap. So here in this picture we see that the winemaker has punched down part of the cap into the fermentation. Here we see a winemaker pumping over. So they have a hose that's connected to the bottom of this tank and then to a pump, and that pumps the juice or the wine up through this hose, and the winemaker is spraying the top of the cap to wet the cap, keep bad bugs from growing, and increase the contact between the fermenting juice and the skins. Here's another picture of a pump over using a sprinkler device. So like I said, in part 3 we will look at more skin contact. Thanks for watching, appreciate it, and